Sign this contract, or your little sister disappears before midnight." Emily thought the Mafia boss was bluffing until Victor Moretti slid a live photo across the table, her 17-year-old sister walking home, followed by a black sedan. In 10 seconds, Emily had to choose: marry a 65-year-old crime lord, give him an heir, or watch her family be destroyed piece by piece. Picture a room where the air is colder than ice. Sign the paper, or your sister arrives at my penthouse before the clock strikes 12. Those words stopped time for Emily. Her fingers, pale and trembling, hovered over the contract. Victor Moretti sat across from her, a statue of pure power. He slid a photograph of little Megan, walking alone, completely exposed. Emily's voice was a fragile breath when she called him a liar, but Victor's tone was heavy steel. An 18-month marriage contract, an heir. In return, her father's $4 million debt vanishes. Sometimes, the heaviest chains we wear are forged from our love for others. Emily picked up the pen, her entire body shaking, as Victor whispered his chilling praise. "You and I have both seen how fast life can turn, haven't we?" Before we step further into the dark, hit subscribe and drop your city in the comments. Just 3 hours ago, Emily was a free woman. Now, she's trapped 70 floors above the glittering streets of Manhattan, watching her future evaporate. Her voice cracked, insisting her father was a simple bank manager, a Sunday churchgoer, who didn't mix with men of violence. Victor merely leaned back, 65 years old, silver hair catching the dim light, his face carved from unyielding marble. He was a man who didn't age, he only gathered power, and with a single sentence, he shattered her reality. Her saintly father, he told her, was nothing but a compulsive gambler and a desperate thief. The cold truth always hits the hardest in the middle of the night. Victor laid it all out. 6 long years of stealing from the wrong accounts. Atlantic City, Las Vegas. Sweaty, desperate online poker games at 3 in the morning. A staggering $4.2 million. Emily whispered it was impossible, but the mahogany table was suddenly covered in damning bank statements. The numbers blurred together through her rising tears. Victor's voice remained perfectly flat, almost clinical. Her father hadn't gone to Boston. He had run, abandoned his wife, abandoned his daughters. He was hiding out in a cheap Atlantic City hotel room right this second. Victor never raised his voice, but the weight of his words was crushing. He always knew exactly where her father was. Let the shadows pull you in for a second. Victor let the old man run, for one simple reason: to witness the profound cowardice of a father, leaving his blood behind to save his own skin. And the tragic rule of Victor's world is absolute. A father's unpaid sins always fall upon the children. Emily bolted upright, panic rising in her throat, threatening to call the police. But Victor's command cut through the room like a physical blow. "Sit down." Her knees gave out instantly. Without a flicker of emotion, Victor tapped his phone and turned the glowing screen toward her. A live video feed. Her sweet, innocent sister Megan, bouncing down the sidewalk with her earbuds in, totally blind to the heavy black sedan trailing just behind her. A single, broken cry escaped Emily's lips. The true terror of the midnight hour is realizing you have absolutely nowhere to hide. Emily begged him to stop, but Victor just pocketed his phone with terrifying calm. He didn't just know their names, he owned their entire existence. He recited their lives like a morbid grocery list. Megan's dreams of working with animals, her naive little boyfriend. He knew about her mother's late nights at the grocery store, the terrifying reality of her rationed insulin. And then, he turned the mirror on Emily. 22, drowning in rent, working herself to the bone, across 2 jobs, just to stay afloat. He even knew about the study group she was supposed to be at right now. There is nothing more paralyzing than realizing Glamotspan is coming quietly watching your every move. The oxygen completely vanished from the room. Emily gasped, desperate to understand how this stranger had dissected her life. For 3 agonizing weeks, while she worried about her missing father, Victor had been watching from the shadows, evaluating her every move, deeming her acceptable. When she asked for what, his answer made the entire penthouse spin. To give him an heir, He stood by the massive windows, staring out at the glittering expanse of Manhattan, like a solitary king surveying an empty kingdom. The real tragedy spilled out next. 30 years ago, his first wife was taken from him, murdered while carrying his child, all because of his own blinding arrogance. A bitter lesson that power means absolutely nothing if you have no one to leave it to. For 30 long years, Victor had built a fortress of wealth and power. But a fortress without a family is just a decorated tomb. Emily, fighting back tears, told him to buy a dog. That actually earned a ghost of a smile. But he didn't need a pet. He needed legacy. He was too old for romance, too hardened for the complicated, scheming women of his dark world. He wanted a clean transaction, marriage, a pregnancy, a healthy child to carry his name. And the price he was willing to pay was staggering. Her father's massive debt wiped clean forever. A paid-off home for her sick mother. Every single dime of her sister's veterinary school covered. He was buying her body and her future. Using the one currency he knew, she couldn't refuse the safety of her family. The offer kept piling up like heavy gold chains. He promised to erase her student loans and build a massive trust fund just for her. 18 months. That was the timeline. 6 months to conceive, 9 months to carry the child, and 3 months to recover. Then she could walk away forever. But the baby would stay with him. Non-negotiable. Emily was suffocating, calling it human trafficking. But to a man like Victor, it was just business. He wasn't looking for love or even affection. He was looking for a vessel. Often, in life, the cruelest deals are presented as the most logical ones. Her body creates his legacy, and in return, he secures the financial future of 3 generations of her family. Cold, calculated, and terrifyingly simple. We all try to convince ourselves that we have a choice. But the alternative Victor presented was a nightmare. He slowly laid out 3 more photos on the dark wood. Megan at school, her mother locking up the store alone in the dead of night, their fragile little apartment building. If she said no, he still had to balance his bloody ledger. He calmly explained how he would buy her mother's building, just to throw her out onto the street. He mentioned the young boyfriend's family, how a single phone call from him would destroy the father's construction job and leave them starving. When Emily accused him of making threats, Victor's eyes turned flat and dead. He wasn't threatening anyone. He was just explaining the cold, mechanical consequences of saying no. Let's listen closely, because this is where the mask completely slips. Victor didn't make threats. Threats are for amateurs praying that fear will do the heavy lifting. He only made ironclad promises. He promised that if she walked out that door, her family would slowly, quietly drown in financial ruin. And she would be too busy drowning right beside them to throw a lifeline. Emily's chest heaved with panicked breaths as she pleaded to know why he chose her. Why not a professional surrogate? Why not a woman desperate for a taste of high society? Victor leaned into the shadows, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. He didn't trust ambition. Surrogates blackmail. Gold diggers scheme. But Emily possessed the one trait he could absolutely control. Pure, unadulterated desperation. He knew the deepest truth of the human heart. A person will endure any hell to protect the people they love. That singular devotion made Emily incredibly reliable and entirely controllable. A heavy, suffocating silence blanketed the high-rise room. She stared down at the photographs, her little sister's bright smile, her mother's exhausted, hollowed-out eyes. When she finally found the breath to ask for time, Victor simply glanced at his expensive watch. 10 seconds. He started the countdown, his voice steady as a metronome. 9, 8. Emily's mind was thrashing like a trapped animal. There had to be a way out, a hidden door she wasn't seeing. 7. But there was only the photograph of Megan. 17, innocent, and completely at the mercy of a monster. 6. The image of her mother slipping into a diabetic coma flashed behind her eyes. 5. The bitter sting of her father's ultimate betrayal, abandoning them to wolves while he hid in the dark. 4. She was only 22, drowning in debt, totally powerless against the tidal wave crashing down on her. 3. The engagement ring sat on the desk, 3 carats of platinum catching the chandelier's light. A beautiful, terrible shackle, too. She looked at Victor's face. The stone-cold certainty in his eyes confirmed he would destroy her family without losing a single night of sleep. 1. The syllable tore its way out of her throat. Yes, she choked on her own surrender. Victor offered a single, approving nod. Emily's hands violently trembled. She demanded it all in writing. She wanted every single promise carved into stone. The house, the tuition, the trust fund. But the devil always does his homework. Victor calmly pulled out a second, thicker folder. His lawyers had drafted the entire agreement 3 days ago. He had been completely confident she would break. When she accused him of knowing her answer all along, his response carried a strange, heavy sorrow. He knew she loved her family far more than she loved her own freedom. That kind of love isn't a weakness, listeners. In a dark world, it's the only reliable weapon you can use against truly good people. Emily pulled the 47-page document close. The legal jargon was an impenetrable maze. Victor pointed out page 17. The ironclad rule of custody. He keeps the child. Forever. You and I are going to look at this together, because this is where the trap snaps shut. Victor walked her through the clauses like a tour guide in hell. Page 23 outlined her $2 million buyout. Page 31 offered the ultimate shield. Her family would be permanently untouchable by his crime syndicate. But when she dared to ask what would happen if she ran, his voice turned to absolute ice. Page 39, breach the contract, and her family instantly becomes collateral damage. He gave her one final piece of advice: do not run. Do not fight. Give him 18 months, and she walks away breathing. Emily's trembling fingers finally closed around the heavy pen. When did the nightmare begin? 6 days. The venue, the witnesses, the wedding. It was already done. A dress fitting tomorrow morning. A wedding in less than a week. The sheer madness of it made Emily's voice crack in desperation. But Victor simply stood up, towering over the room. At 65, the man had zero patience for a long, romantic engagement. It was the final ultimatum: sign away her body and her future, or walk out and let her loved ones burn. She stared down at the dotted line. In the quiet darkness of her mind, she heard her little sister laughing. She felt her mother's tired, comforting embrace. The fragrant memories of her childhood home pushed the pen down. She signed her soul away. Victor inspected the ink, welcoming her to the family. She fired back that she was just a purchased incubator. His reply was chillingly calm. Whatever helps you survive the night. Let us step into this cold room together, you and I. Marco, a man built of pure muscle, took Emily by the elbow. It was not a violent grip, just a heavy reminder that she was trapped. Before she could leave, Victor's voice cut the silence. Emily, he said, his face an absolute void. I am not a good man. I have done things that would rot your soul, but I keep my word. Give me a child and you walk away wealthy. Betray me, and you will learn what happens to those who break my contracts. Emily's voice trembled. Is that supposed to comfort me? Victor turned back to the dark window. It is supposed to clarify expectations. Sleep well. Sometimes, the most brutal honesty is the only compass we get in the dark. Her tomorrow was a terrifying dawn. Marco guided her down a silent corridor lined with museum-quality art, all guarded by men holding heavy artillery. Her new prison was breathtakingly beautiful. This is you, Marco grunted, opening a massive door at the hall's end. The bedroom easily dwarfed her entire apartment. A massive bed, a sprawling bathroom, and a closet stuffed with garments chosen by strangers. Panic button is right there, Marco pointed. 20 armed men will rush in. Do not push it unless you are drawing your last breath. Emily looked at the heavy door, her heart hammering. What if I want to leave? She asked softly. Marco's response was flat. You cannot. Remember this tonight, a golden cage is still a cage. There was no cruelty in Marco's voice, only the dead weight of reality. Doors lock from the outside. Windows do not open, he recited. You try to hurt yourself, we stop you. You try to hurt Mr. Moretti, we stop you faster. This is not a hotel. Emily felt the air thinning. Can I call my family? He denied her instantly. Marco mysteriously produced her phone. "We monitor every word," he warned. "Tell the truth, and the contract burns. Stray from the script, and your mother loses her home before sunset." Emily's throat tightened like a knot. "What is the story?" she whispered. "You met him at a gallery 3 months ago. A secret romance. Life forces us to tell the most painful lies just to protect the people we love. He proposed, you said yes. A whirlwind romance. You are madly in love. Learn the script," Marco commanded. Emily's voice broke under the weight. "My family will never believe that." Marco did not even blink. "Then make them believe it." He warned her not to be late for breakfast, and the heavy door clicked shut. The lock echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. Suddenly, her phone vibrated, a text from her sister, asking where she was. Emily stared at the glowing screen, paralyzed by her choices. Before she could type, an unknown number flashed. "Tell them you are studying with a friend tonight." Nothing more. V. Sometimes, we realize far too late that our lives have become a play, and someone else is writing the lines. He was watching her. She could feel the invisible eyes, the hidden cameras dissecting her every breath. With trembling fingers, she typed a quick lie to her sister about a late study session. Megan replied fast, dropping a casual detail that shattered Emily's heart. "Mom says come home tomorrow. She made lasagna." The dam finally broke. Hot, bitter tears spilled down her cheeks. Lasagna, her mother's ultimate gesture of love when money was tight. Emily knew she would miss that dinner, and countless others. In 6 short days, she would become Mrs. Victor Moretti, and the girl who used to own her future would cease to exist. She curled up on the silk sheets. The heaviest grief, my friends, is mourning a life while still trapped inside it. She refused to take off her clothes. Settling in would make the nightmare real. When sleep finally dragged her under at 4 a.m, her dreams were full of smoke and weeping relatives. Morning arrived with a different kind of brutality, the violence of absolute normality. Maria knocked precisely at 8. She was an older woman with gentle eyes and a practiced smile, one that had likely witnessed many broken spirits before. "Good morning," she cooed softly. "Mr. Moretti sent me to prepare you." Emily rubbed her swollen eyes. Prepare for what? A dizzying schedule of dress fittings, lawyers, and forced dinners. We often forget that destruction does not always come with loud noises. Sometimes it arrives carrying a daily itinerary. Maria's pleasant expression was completely bulletproof. "You will adjust," she promised. Emily's voice trembled with raw desperation. "I do not want to adjust. I want to go home." Maria calmly opened the massive closet doors. "This is home now." She began selecting garments, chatting cheerfully about the upcoming designer fitting. Inside, Emily was screaming. She wanted to shatter the mirrors and run until her lungs bled. But instead, she stood up slowly. She let Maria dress her, moving her arms like a lifeless mannequin. She was just another expensive toy in Victor Moretti's collection. Breakfast proved to be an even colder affair. Victor sat at a massive dining table, reading the paper. "Sit," he commanded without glancing her way. Emily deliberately chose a seat 3 chairs away, seeking a tiny sliver of distance. Victor's eyes darted to the empty spot beside him. "When we are out in the world, you will be at my side constantly. Start practicing right now." Reluctantly, Emily moved closer. A lavish breakfast immediately materialized before her. "I am not hungry," she muttered. "Eat anyway," Victor replied, turning a page. "You will need your strength." Her humiliation boiled over into venom. "For what? Being your breeding stock?" Slowly, the paper lowered. Victor's eyes locked onto hers, cold as a frozen winter sky. "If you are trying to provoke my anger so I release you," he murmured. "Defiance is a beautiful fire, but sometimes it only burns the one holding the match." "It will not work," Victor finished, his tone entirely undisturbed. "I do not care if you hate me. Hate makes people predictable. Keep hating me. Just do it while eating your breakfast." Emily surrendered, lifting her silver fork. The expensive food tasted like absolute ash. Victor calmly explained that a legendary designer was arriving soon to curate her entire wardrobe for the next 18 months. "Be polite to her," he instructed. Emily challenged him. Or what? Victor folded his paper with terrible precision. Or I will be disappointed. You represent me now. Do it well, and your life gets easier. It is your choice. She glared at him. Nothing about this is my choice. Victor leaned in. You chose to sign. The illusion of free will is a heavy chain. Own that choice, Victor demanded, devoid of pity. Do not play the victim when you made a calculated trade to save your blood. It diminishes us both. Emily slammed her fork onto the table, the clatter echoing. You gave me 10 seconds to decide, she cried. He did not flinch. I could have given you 10 milliseconds. Your answer would have been exactly the same. Standing up, he slowly adjusted his expensive cufflinks. You are smart, Emily. That is why I chose you. Smart enough to know when the cage is locked. Stop wasting your energy on a rage you simply cannot afford. He walked away, his footsteps fading into silence. Emily sat alone, staring at her broken reflection. Sometimes, sheer survival requires surrendering our most precious pride. Consider her reality for a moment, friends. 22 years old, a week away from binding herself to a ruthless monster. The agonizing truth gnawing at her soul was that Victor was right. She had made the choice, and now the burden was hers to carry. Right on schedule, the designer Colette arrived. She was an older French woman, with the calculating eyes of a hawk. For 3 excruciating laps, she circled Emily in absolute silence. Finally, she stopped. Strip, she commanded. Emily blinked, humiliated. Excuse me? Colette waved her hand. Take off your clothes, I must see the canvas. Quickly, Mr. Moretti does not pay me to wait. Emily's cheeks burned hot. I am not, she protested. Colette cut her off sharply. You are Mrs. Moretti now, or you will be in 6 days. Colette finished, her gaze merciless. Strip, I have seen 10,000 naked bodies. Yours is nothing special. Something so profoundly absurd about that brutal honesty made a hysterical laugh bubble out of Emily's throat. Stripped of all dignity, she undressed. For 3 grueling hours, she became a mannequin. Assistants draped silks and argued in French, poking at her skin. Halfway through, Victor appeared. He casually leaned against the doorframe, sipping an espresso, watching her stand exposed. You could leave, Emily spat, flushing crimson. I could, Victor agreed, taking a slow sip. But this is interesting. Me being humiliated? She asked. No, he replied quietly. You not breaking. There is profound power in enduring. Most women would be a puddle of tears by now, Victor observed. But you are angry. Anger is much more useful than crying. Emily's jaw tightened. Useful for what? Victor's eyes darkened. Survival. Setting his ceramic cup down, he shifted his attention. Colette, what is the vision? The old woman did not miss a beat. Champagne silk, a strict column silhouette. No train, no veil. She wants the world to know this is a transaction, not a fairy tale. We give her armor, not a princess fantasy. Victor turned his heavy gaze back to Emily. Is that what you want? She stared right back into the abyss of his eyes. Yes. Victor gave a single nod. Make her look like a queen, not a victim. As he walked away, Colette smiled. You have a spine. You will need it. The afternoon brought endless legal documents, ironclad contracts that made her stomach churn. Then came the devastating blow. Page 17, the lead lawyer stated plainly. This is critical. Upon birth, the child becomes Mr. Moretti's sole responsibility. You hold no parental rights, no custody, and no visitation. Emily Seth's knuckles turned white. What if I change my mind? She whispered. The lawyer's tone was purely mechanical. Then you breach the agreement and immediately forfeit all protections for your family. Panic gripped Emily's chest, squeezing the air from her lungs. So I give birth, and then what? I just never see my baby again. It is a tragic truth that the deepest, most permanent wounds in this life are often inflicted with a simple pen. Welcome back, night owls. Turn the dial, let the static fade, and let me paint a picture for you. We start in a room made of glass and cold steel, high above the city. Emily sits across from Christine, staring at a custody agreement that demands she sign away a child that does not even exist yet. Christine calls Mr. Moretti generous, right? Financial security, protection for her family, and the rare gift of staying alive. Emily signs the paper, the pen heavy as lead. When the lawyers finally pack their briefcases and leave, she sits alone. No loud sobs. Just quiet, heavy tears falling as the Manhattan skyline sparkles outside. It is the sound of a woman breaking in half. She was really doing this, trading her soul to keep her family breathing. You have to ask yourself, what kind of mother trades an unborn child for survival? The door swings open, casting a long shadow. Victor stands there, perfectly framed by the harsh hallway light. The car is waiting, he tells her. A dinner with associates. Emily's voice splinters as she tells him she cannot fake a smile for his friends. But Victor does not have friends. He has business partners. He steps closer, the air turning to ice, and delivers the ultimate truth of his world. You will pretend, he says, because this is the life you chose. Adjust or drown. There is no third option. He holds out his hand. For a long moment, Emily just stares at his outstretched hand. Then she takes it. His grip is warm, unshakable, anchoring her to a reality she never wanted. Walking out of that penthouse, a terrifying truth washes over her. She is starting to understand him. Not love him, no. But she understands the brutal, cold math that makes a man like Victor exist. The restaurant they enter does not list prices. It is a private sanctuary, guarded by men with concealed weapons, where men in $10,000 suits discuss human lives over wine that costs more than Emily's entire tuition. Victor places his hand flat against her lower back. It is a mark of ownership, a warning to the room. She wants to pull away from his touch, but her feet stay rooted. Gentlemen, Victor announces, introducing his new bride. 5 pairs of predatory eyes lock onto her, calculating her exact worth. A man with a heavy Russian accent calls her young. Very young. 22, Victor answers without a flicker of emotion. Old enough. The Russian flashes a smile with far too many teeth, mocking Victor for finally replacing Sophia. Emily feels Victor's hand go rigid against her spine. A micro-expression she should not know how to read, but somehow she does. I am not replacing anyone. Victor shoots back, his voice dangerously calm. I am moving forward. She sits beside him, breathing in cedar and power. You and I both know what fear tastes like, right? It sits on the back of your tongue like copper. Waiters pour expensive wine, but Emily cannot stomach a single bite. An older Italian man named Carlo leans over his plate, noting the absolute terror in her eyes. She is adjusting, Victor answers, smooth as velvet. Carlo is not letting it go. He wants to know how a college girl ends up with a ghost like Victor. Emily freezes. Under the heavy mahogany table, Victor's hand finds hers and squeezes hard. A command. She clears her dry throat and recites the lie. An art gallery, 3 months ago. A romantic chance meeting. Carlo raises an eyebrow, clearly smelling the blood in the water. She forces herself to look Carlo dead in the eye and tells him Victor was persistent. The men around the table erupt into low laughter. Persistent, the Russian echoes, calling it a perfect choice of words. They all know Victor gets exactly what he wants, no matter who he has to break to get it. Emily feels sick to her stomach. Victor's thumb slowly traces circles onto her palm. Is he trying to calm her down, or is he keeping her quiet? She cannot tell. Victor steers the room away, announcing the wedding is this Saturday. A small ceremony, family only. Carlo acts offended, pressing a hand to his chest, demanding an invite. Victor promises a reception next month, once Emily adjusts. Carlo pushes his luck, asking if adjusting is what they are calling it now. The air in the room goes dead cold. Victor lowers his voice to a whisper and tells him to drop it. Carlo throws his hands up, backing away from the ledge. The rest of the dinner blurs into talk of shipping lanes and territory. Men discussing blood and money like she is totally invisible. But Victor never moves his hand from hers. It is a heavy, burning reminder of who she belongs to. 2 hours later, they finally walk to the car. Emily's jaw is throbbing from the fake smiles. The second the heavy door closes, she rips her hand away from his and tells him never to touch her again. Victor just looks out the window. In public, "You are mine," Victor tells her, his voice flat. He says she better get used to the contact. Emily is shaking now, her voice cracking as she tells him everyone in that room knew the whole thing was a lie. Victor adjusts his cuffs. Of course they knew, he says. Everyone in his circle knows exactly who is bleeding and who is holding the knife. The performance was not to fool them. It was a test for her. He turns his dark eyes toward her and says her art gallery story sounded exactly like a bad script. Make it yours, he demands. If she cannot lie better than that, they are both going to end up in the ground. Weakness is an open invitation for a bullet in his line of work. He tells her she has to learn the part, because her family's safety is riding entirely on her performance. Emily stares at this man, her chest rising and falling, and spits out that she hates him. Good, Victor replies, staring out at the blurred city lights. Hate is an honest emotion, and he can work with honesty. Back at the penthouse, she runs straight to her bedroom, locks the heavy oak door, and collapses onto the mattress. Her phone vibrates against the silk sheets. It is a message from her mother, asking if everything is okay. Emily stares at the glowing screen. How does she explain that she sold her future to a mob boss to keep her family safe? She types back that everything is perfectly fine. The lie burns her fingers. A second later, another message pops up from an unknown number. It is Victor. He tells her the text to her mother was better, but next time she should say things are good, not great. It is more believable. Emily hurls the phone against the far wall. She buries her face in her pillow and screams until her throat is raw. This is her reality now. A gilded cage, eyes watching her every move, waiting for the wedding in exactly 5 days. The next morning, a housekeeper named Maria knocks on the door at 7. Victor wants her in the gym. Emily is confused. Maria gives her a sad, knowing look. You are going to need to know how to fight, she says. More than you realize. The private gym takes up the entire 3rd floor. Mirrors, heavy bags, cold metal. Victor is already there, and the workout gear makes him look even more lethal. You are 3 minutes late, he says, congratulating her on owning a watch. He tells her to change into the gear waiting in the locker. Victor straightened, casting a long shadow across the mat. In my world, weakness gets you killed, he murmured, a low, gravelly hum. I have stayed alive by staying strong. Now I am going to teach you the same. In his mind, she belonged to him, and Victor ruthlessly protected what was his. He knew the cold truth of life. You can never rely entirely on someone else to save you. For the next hour, he taught her the brutal art of survival, how to break a grip, where to strike to shatter bone. He molded her stance like a sculptor working with cold clay. His touches were purely clinical, entirely professional, but Emily felt the heavy weight of them sinking into her very soul. Again, Victor demanded, watching her fail to break his hold for the 5th time. Faster! Breathless, she whispered that she couldn't. His eyes darkened. You can. You are just afraid of hurting me, Victor said, his voice dropping into a dangerous, velvet register. Stop being polite. I am not fragile. Taking the bait, Emily twisted her body with sudden ferocity, driving her elbow hard into his ribs. Victor let out a rough grunt and released her. Better, he breathed, rubbing his aching side. Do it again. They pushed through the agony until her muscles screamed for mercy, until sweat soaked her clothes and every breath burned her lungs. When he finally called an end to the torment, Emily collapsed against the mat, completely spent. Why are you doing this? She gasped, chest heaving. I am just an incubator. Why do you care if I can fight? Victor grabbed a towel and wiped his face. Because my enemies will come for you eventually. And when they do, I need to know you can survive long enough for me to reach you. Your enemies? Emily let out a bitter, hollow laugh. Great. More things to look forward to. Victor looked down at her, his expression unreadable. You married into a war, Emily, he said, extending a calloused hand to help her up. Act like it. She stared at his palm for a long moment before letting him pull her to her feet. He lifted her so easily, revealing a terrifying strength she had not fully grasped until now. Suddenly, their faces were mere inches apart. His dark eyes scanned hers, searching for the fire buried beneath her fear. You are stronger than you think, he whispered. When she confessed that she did not feel strong, Victor offered a quiet truth. Strength is never a feeling. It is a choice you make every single day. Shower, he commanded, stepping back. Breakfast in 30 minutes, then we meet the planner. He walked away, leaving her trembling. Not from fear, but from the sudden, terrifying realization of her new reality. You and I know how bizarre the normal world looks when you are trapped in a nightmare. Enter Rose, a tiny wedding planner who spoke entirely in breathless exclamations. "Oh, this is so exciting, a winter wedding," she chirped. "Mr. Moretti, you have been a bachelor for so long. I was beginning to think you would never settle down." Victor remained absolutely stone-faced. "Keep it simple, Rose. Elegant. No circus." Rose nodded eagerly, suggesting white orchids, soft candlelight, and a string quartet. "No white," Emily interrupted abruptly. Rose blinked in sheer confusion, reminding her that it was a wedding. "No white," Emily repeated, locking eyes with Victor. "We agreed. Champagne." A flicker of something crossed Victor's eyes. Was it approval? Surprise? "Everything champagne and gold," he commanded. Rose swallowed her arguments instantly. "How sophisticated. I love it," Rose lied smoothly. For the next 2 hours, they endlessly debated floral arrangements, string quartets, and seating charts. Emily barely existed in the conversation. She just nodded vaguely whenever someone prompted her. This was not a wedding. It was a cold business transaction dressed up in silk and flowers. When Rose finally packed up her swatches and left, Emily moved to escape the room. "Sit," Victor commanded, his voice pinning her to the spot. She slowly sank back down as he poured himself a neat scotch, offering her a glass which she silently declined. "You are doing well," he noted. Emily stared at the floor. "I am surviving," she replied. He sat across from her. "In my world, they are the exact same thing. I know this is difficult." Her laugh was sharp like broken glass. Do you actually know, or are you just saying words?" Victor's response was terribly quiet, echoing with a dangerous edge. "I was 19 when father sold me to the Morettis. Not literally, but close enough. He owed them money. They needed soldiers. So, I became one." He confessed to killing his first man at 20, a memory that still haunted the dark corners of his mind. Emily just stared, stunned that he was comparing his bloody history to her current torment. "I am telling you, I understand cages," Victor said, his eyes freezing over like winter ice. "I have lived in them most of my life. The only difference is, I learned to make my cage bigger." He leaned forward, laying out the harsh reality of their arrangement. She could gain actual power by playing the game well. Right now, she was a victim, but she did not have to stay one. "Learn my world," he urged. "When you leave in 18 months, you will leave with more than just money. You will leave with knowledge, connections, and real power," he promised. Emily shook her head, tears stinging her eyes. "I do not want power. I want my life back." Victor's tone turned utterly brutal. "That life is gone. It died the exact moment you signed the contract. Mourn it if you need to, but do not waste time wishing for resurrections that will never come." Her eyes burned with helpless fury as she called him a monster. Victor did not flinch. "Yes," he agreed, with zero hesitation and no shame. "But I am a monster who keeps his word. And right now I am the only thing standing between your family and a dozen other monsters who would be far, far worse." That heavy truth struck Emily right in the chest, knocking the breath out of her. Victor stood up, adjusting his cuffs. "Dinner at 7. Wear the navy dress. We are meeting with a United States Senator who owes me several favors." "How deep does this go?" Emily asked, her voice rising in a panicked crescendo. "Deeper than you can possibly imagine," Victor replied, walking toward the door. "Welcome to the real world, Emily. It is much uglier than anything they teach you in college." That evening, draped in the navy dress, she sat beside him and smiled through a lavish dinner, while powerful politicians discussed policy and illegal payoffs as if they were one and the same. She was learning a dark truth about humanity, that Victor's world had absolutely no boundaries and no rules, only power and those ruthless enough to wield it. And tomorrow, she was marrying the man who sat at the very center of it all. The following day, just 24 hours before the ceremony, the pressure finally shattered her. Alone in her bedroom, a massive panic attack took hold, full body tremors. She could not breathe. She could not think. Tomorrow, this nightmare became permanent. Driven by pure, blind terror, she slammed her hand onto the panic button. 20 seconds later, the heavy oak door burst open. Armed guards flooded the room, weapons drawn and ready for violence. Victor appeared right behind them, his sharp eyes assessing the empty room in a fraction of a second. "Out," he barked at the guards, who vanished just as quickly as they had arrived. He crossed the floor to where Emily was hyperventilating, completely undone by her own mind. He dropped to his knees beside her. "Breathe," he ordered, his voice remarkably steady. "In through your nose, out through your mouth." Emily's words tripped over each other in a frantic rush. She could not marry him. She could not have his baby. Victor gripped her shoulders, providing a firm, physical anchor to reality. "You are panicking. It is normal. Breathe with me." He inhaled deeply. He held his breath, then released it slowly. Emily tried to match his rhythm, once, twice, 10 agonizing times. Eventually, the suffocating panic began to recede, leaving her hollow, shaking, and utterly exhausted. "I am not ready," she whispered into the quiet space between them. Victor let go of her shoulders. "No one is ever ready for the things that break them," he said, his voice laced with the melancholic wisdom of a man who had been broken many times. "But you will do it anyway, because you are stronger than this moment." She asked how he could possibly know that. Victor held her gaze. "Because you are still here. You could have run a dozen times, but you didn't. That is not weakness. That is a survival instinct. Trust it." Wiping her tear-stained cheeks, she asked if he ever felt guilt or regret. "Every day," he confessed, "but guilt does not change reality. I acknowledge it, and I move forward anyway." "That is psychotic," she muttered, staring at the man who had bought her future. "That is effective," Victor countered smoothly. He stood up, offering his large hand to her once again. "Get some sleep. Tomorrow is a very long day." This time Emily ignored his hand. A dark question had been weighing on her mind. "Will you force me on our wedding night?" Victor's face turned to absolute stone. "I am many things, Emily, but I am not a monster who forces himself on women. When you come to my bed, it will be your choice, however long that takes." "And if she never chose? Then they would use medicine," he explained coldly. "Less pleasant, but just as effective." He ordered her to sleep and finally left the room. Sitting alone in the crushing darkness, Emily stared down at the massive diamond on her finger. A small, quiet part of her wondered what would happen if she finally stopped fighting and simply started surviving. The wedding was objectively beautiful, and Emily absolutely hated that fact. You and I have probably been to weddings that felt more like funerals, but this was a whole different level of grief. It was an intimate ceremony with 20 people, all from Victor's inner circle. There was no one from Emily's past, because she could never explain the dark bargain she had made. The champagne silk dress hugged her perfectly, making her skin glow under the soft lights. With her hair swept back in an elegant twist and no veil to hide her face, she looked like a stunning queen marrying a dangerous king. But inside, she felt like a prisoner walking the last mile to her own execution. Victor waited at the altar in a tailored tuxedo, his silver hair perfectly styled, his expression impossible to read. Emily walked down the aisle entirely alone, carrying the crushing weight of her tragic choice with every single step. When she finally reached him, Victor took her trembling hand. His grip was warm and grounding, a stark contrast to the cold reality of the room. The officiant began speaking hollow words about love and eternal commitment, concepts that meant absolutely nothing in this beautiful, tragic cage. "Do you, Victor, take Emily?" the man asked. "I do," Victor replied, his voice a deep, unshakable anchor. "Do you, Emily, take Victor?" Emily's throat tightened painfully. The walls seemed to spin around her. Sensing her hesitation, Victor squeezed her hand just once. A silent, firm command. "I do," she whispered softly. The officiant pronounced them husband and wife. Victor reached up to lift a veil she was not wearing, choosing instead to brush his lips against hers. It was a cold, professional kiss, yet Emily felt the shock of it reverberate through her entire body. The room erupted in applause. Emily Carter was officially gone. The reception proved to be far worse than the ceremony itself. For hours, strangers congratulated her. Dangerous men kissed her hand while their wives sized her up with cold, envious eyes. "You are very lucky," one woman purred, wearing diamond earrings that caught the light like shattered glass. "Victor is one of the most powerful men on the East Coast." Emily forced a radiant smile. Victor stayed close, his hand a heavy, constant weight on her back. When they cut the champagne and gold cake, he fed her a bite. "Smile," he murmured. "Security cameras are watching." Emily smiled on cue as flashbulbs captured the beautiful lie. At midnight, the guests vanished. Victor led her upstairs, past her room, opening his own door. "You will sleep in my bed," he said, "nothing else. Welcome back to the late shift. Tonight, let us look at two souls trapped in a very dark room." Victor pulled off his heavy tuxedo jacket. His voice was steady, telling Emily to just sleep, because the enemies of his empire were always watching. They had to sell the illusion of this arranged marriage. He offered her the bathroom for privacy, and she took it, fleeing like a frightened bird. In the cold light, Emily stared at her own reflection. 8 days. That was all it took to become a Mafia wife. When she finally stepped out, Victor was already in bed, shirtless, flipping the pages of a book, as if the world outside was not waiting to tear them apart. He asked her which side of the bed she wanted, left or right. She whispered that she preferred the left. He told her to take it, his tone betraying absolutely nothing. Victor turned a page, his demeanor chillingly calm. He assured her he did not snore or steal covers and would be asleep in 20 minutes. Emily crawled onto the mattress as if it were wired to explode, clinging to the absolute edge. Even then, the intense heat of his body radiated across the cold sheets. Her muscles were locked tight. Victor noticed the tension. He quietly told her to breathe, promising she was safe tonight. When she asked how he could be so steady, he said it was just practice. He mentioned he had slept beside beautiful women and knew self-control. She denied being beautiful, but he called it an objective fact, warning her not to fish for praise. A bitter laugh caught in her throat at the pure madness of it all. He killed the lamp, and a heavy dark swallowed them whole. He wished her a good night, and she whispered it back to the shadows. For hours, Emily lay still, tracing the steady rhythm of his breathing. This dangerous man was her husband now, sleeping beside her, as if this twisted life was normal. When exhaustion dragged her under, her final waking thought was terrifying. Next to him, she actually felt safe. It was not a welcome feeling, but it was real, and that was a dangerous truth. Morning broke, and Emily jolted awake to find Victor, with his heavy arm draped across her waist. She froze completely. His solid chest was pressed firmly against her back, looking like a couple who had shared a bed for decades. He murmured into her hair, noticing her open eyes. She barely took a breath as she whispered that he was touching her. "Welcome back to the midnight hour. You and I know how the dark plays tricks on a captive soul, don't we?" It was 3 a.m. when Victor's deep voice sliced the silence. "You rolled into me," he murmured. "I didn't push you away." His arm tightened around her, a terrifying anchor. "Apparently, you're a cuddler." Emily felt her face burn with humiliating shame. She scrambled to pull away, and the old wolf simply let her go. He sat up, raking a hand through silver hair that looked flawless, even in the bleak dawn. "Breakfast in 30 minutes, he declared. "We have Italian lessons at 9. You're a Moretti now." "I went to college," she pleaded. "You learned art history," he scoffed. "Useless here, now you learn power, politics, how to read a room before someone puts a bullet in you." With that, the bathroom door clicked shut. Left alone, Emily sat there, staring at the empty space where the monster had been sleeping. The heavy linen still held his lingering warmth. She reached out, touching the impression, then yanked her hand back as if the fabric had scorched her skin. What on earth was wrong with her? Over the next 3 weeks, her existence warped into a suffocating routine she never asked for. Brutal morning gym sessions with Victor, exhausting afternoons with tutors, drilling Italian, high finance, and the hollow art that wealthy criminals collected. The nights were an endless blur of corrupt politicians and ruthless mobsters. And every single night, she returned to his bed. The agonizing part was that he never actually touched her. He never forced his heavy hands upon her, merely shared the space as if this twisted arrangement was entirely normal. And Emily absolutely loathed how normal it felt. "Your accent is improving," Victor noted one morning over his dark espresso. "Don't sound so surprised," she shot back. "I'm not. I knew you were smart," he replied smoothly. "Tonight, we attend the opera. Wear the emerald dress." When she protested, his calculating eyes caught the morning light. "You will like it tonight," he promised. "This performance involves a $30 million weapons deal. The music is just background noise." Emily felt a sickening plunge in her gut. He was turning beautiful art into a blood-soaked marketplace. "I conduct business everywhere," Victor said, placing his porcelain cup down with a sharp clink. "The senator will be there, along with his mistress. She's the one who actually calls the shots. So play nice." Emily stared at him, stunned. His mistress runs public policy? "Welcome to reality," he sighed, standing tall and imposing. "The faces you see on television are merely puppets. Real power operates strictly in the shadows, and you're learning to see them." He was not wrong. She was learning the miserable truth. Every elegant charity gala masked filthy money. Every polite smile hid a loaded gun. Victor's entire empire was stunningly beautiful, yet rotten to the core like sweet fruit left out in the blazing sun. And she was adapting faster than she wanted to admit. Maria stepped in softly. "Your sister called the main line. She's asking why you haven't visited." Emily's heart instantly flatlined. "You and I both know the sheer panic of trying to protect someone innocent, right?" "What did you tell her?" Emily gasped. Maria offered a pitying look, explaining she claimed they were honeymooning. But Megan wanted to meet her new brother-in-law. Emily whipped around to Victor in terror. "No, absolutely not." But the old wolf remained entirely calm. "Bring her here for lunch this Saturday," he commanded. Emily trembled, terrified of letting her pure sister into this bloody world. "She'll see a wealthy husband. Nothing more," Victor said smoothly. "Unless you give her a reason to look deeper. Can you lie to her convincingly? Then you'd better learn fast," Victor replied coldly, his thumbs tapping away on his phone. "Saturday at noon. Maria will prepare lunch, will be appropriately boring and in love. Then she leaves to her safe, normal life." But then, his dark eyes turned to absolute ice. "If she sees through it, we'll need to have a different conversation about what she knows. Pray she's not as smart as you." Those words hung in the air like a death sentence. Saturday morning arrived with merciless speed, bringing waves of nauseating panic. Emily changed clothes 4 times, forcing her facial muscles into a practiced plastic smile before the mirror. When the noon chime finally echoed, her fingers trembled so violently that Victor had to trap the "p" inside his massive hands. "Breathe," he commanded. "You married a wonderful man. Just believe it for the next 2 hours." "I can't," she choked out. Victor's voice dropped into a dark, terrifying register. "You can. Because if you can't, your sister becomes a liability, and I don't keep liabilities." The threat was crystal clear. Emily turned the knob, letting the outside world in. There stood Megan, 17, dressed in faded jeans and a university sweater, radiating a heartbreaking innocence. The teenager squealed, throwing her arms around her older sister. "You got married and didn't even tell us. Mom is so pissed." Emily clung to her tightly. "I know, I'm sorry. It all happened so fast." "Fast?" Megan stepped back, her eyes going wide with confusion. You've been gone for a solid month. No calls, barely any texts. What the hell is going on?" "Language," Victor interjected smoothly, stepping out from the shadows behind his bride. The teenager's eyes snapped up to the towering patriarch, her jaw practically unhinging. The crime boss smiled a perfect, practiced mask and extended his weathered hand. "You must be a Megan. I'm Victor." The girl took his hand entirely out of her depth. "You're older than I expected," she blurted. Emily wanted the floor to swallow her whole, but Victor's polite smile remained cemented. "It's fine. I'm 65. Your sister is 22. I'm aware the age gap raises the questions. Come in. Megan trailed behind them, gaping at the marble and glass. Holy crap, this place is insane. He does well, Emily whispered weakly. Megan spun around, taking in the extravagant view. This is billionaire-level stuff. What do you do, Victor? Investments, real estate, acquisitions, he answered, delivering the corporate cover story with effortless grace. Lunch, however, was an absolute psychological torture session. Megan fired off eager questions about their romance. Emily lied her way through every response, her soul fracturing with each word. Victor corroborated every false detail flawlessly. They moved like a well-oiled machine of deception, and it was horrifying. Later, when the Mafia boss excused himself, Megan leaned in close. So, you're really happy? Because honestly, you look exhausted. I'm adjusting. Emily forced a bright tone. He's really old, Em. He's distinguished, Emily countered. He's old enough to be your grandfather. Megan whispered, her brow creased with genuine worry. Are you sure this is what you want? Because if someone forced you— No one forced me, Emily interrupted. And the sickening truth was, the lie came tumbling out with terrifying ease now. I love him. I know it's unconventional, but I'm happy. The young girl searched her sister's face for any crack in the facade. Emily held the plastic smile. She didn't blink. Finally, Megan nodded softly. Okay, if you're happy, I'm happy. But you need to call Mom. She's freaking out. I will, I promise. Victor returned just in time, resuming his role as the devoted husband with such masterful charm that even Emily almost believed it. When Megan finally left, Emily collapsed against the door. You did well, Victor stated calmly, watching her crumble. I lied to my sister's face for 2 hours. Yes, and she believed you, he replied, pouring a heavy measure of liquor. That's growth. That's corruption. Her voice shattered. You're turning me into you. Victor's tone turned brutally sharp. No, I'm teaching you survival. Listeners, we often mistake the armor we build for the evil we fight, don't we? In 18 months, he told her, you'll use these exact skills to protect yourself when you leave. Consider it education in staying alive. He drained his glass. There's a difference. Learn it. He walked away, leaving her drowning in the phantom echo of her sister, stolen trust. That night, she lay paralyzed beside him, devoured entirely by guilt. Stop thinking so loud, Victor muttered from the shadows of the bed. I'm not, she whispered back. You're radiating anxiety, he grumbled, rolling over to face her. The faint ambient light caught the dangerous gleam in his ancient eyes. Say what you need to say. I hate lying to her, she confessed, her voice trembling. I know, and I hate that I'm getting good at it. I know that too, he replied softly. She turned to him, searching for a soul in the dark. Do you feel anything? Guilt? Remorse? Anything human? Silence stretched between them, heavy and absolute. I feel quite a bit, he finally admitted. I just don't let it interfere with necessity. That's not an answer. It's the only answer I have. His rough hand found hers under the sheets. Just quiet contact. You think I don't know what I'm doing to you? The old man's voice was shockingly gentle. I've done it to dozens of people, broken them down, rebuilt them into something useful. You're just the first one I felt guilty about. Emily's breath hitched. Why? Because you didn't choose this world. Victor's thumb traced slow circles on her palm. You were collateral damage. I'm practical enough to use you anyway, but that doesn't mean I'm proud of it. Then let me go, she begged. I can't. His refusal was instant. I need what you can give me. That supersedes guilt. You're a monster, she whispered. Yes, he agreed softly in the darkness. But I'm a monster who's honest about what I am. That's more than most men can say. Emily lay awake, haunted by the guilt he claimed to feel. As we close tonight's broadcast, you and I have to ask, does a villain's honesty erase his crimes? For Emily, his confession changed nothing, but it proved he was human, and terrifyingly enough, that made him harder to hate. 3 weeks later, their delicate balance shattered. Emily woke up feeling utterly wrong. The room tilted. Her stomach churned. You're pale, Victor noted. I'm fine, she lied. You're green, he countered. He immediately ordered Maria to call Dr. Russo. Emily tried to stand, but the room violently spun around her. Victor crossed the floor in a heartbeat, catching her fragile frame before she could fall. "Sit!" he barked, his voice laced with panic. Dr. Russo arrived within the hour, while the ruthless boss paced outside the bedroom like a caged beast. Picture this. 20 minutes of agonizing silence, broken by Dr. Russo walking through the door. "Congratulations," she said. "You are pregnant." Emily felt the floor drop out from beneath her, her entire world grinding to a violent halt. Beside her, Victor's face went completely dead, a mask of pure shock. "You are certain?" he demanded. 8 weeks along, Russo confirmed, handing over a slip for prenatal vitamins before leaving them in the heavy quiet. Emily just sat there, staring into the void. 8 weeks. That meant no clinical procedures. It happened naturally. Their bodies had somehow found each other in the dark, seeking warmth when their waking minds were at war. Sometimes, friends, our bodies surrender to a truth our hearts are too stubborn to admit. Victor's rough voice finally shattered her spiral, and she slowly looked up. Victor's face gave away nothing, but his hands, those lethal, unwavering hands, were visibly shaking. "Are you okay?" Emily asked. An absurd question, really. Nothing in this room was okay. Victor sank onto the mattress, the weight of the world suddenly resting on his shoulders. "I thought I was ready," he whispered, "but I am not." His voice cracked, rough and heavy with an ancient pain. 30 years ago, his first wife was murdered while carrying his child. He could not save her. And now, looking at Emily, the ghost of that failure was suffocating him. Time never truly heals a broken heart, does it? It just teaches us how to limp. Emily stared, witnessing pure, unfiltered terror in the eyes of a monster. "I will not let history repeat itself," he swore, standing up abruptly. "Watch me, Marco." Marco was in the doorway before the echo of his name faded. Victor immediately transformed into a general preparing for a bloodbath. He ordered triple security on Emily, bulletproof glass for every window, and a panic room built by the end of the week. "Anyone unverified who steps too close gets shot first." The words hung in the air, cold and merciless. "Victor, you are scaring me," Emily whispered, shrinking back. "Good," he snapped, turning his dark eyes on her. "You are carrying the only thing in this world I truly value, and that makes you a walking target." Over the next month, that terror morphed into an obsession so deep it bordered on sheer madness. We often confuse control with care, forgetting that a cage built out of desperate love is still a cage. 4 new bodyguards shadowed her every step. Cameras watched her from the corners of the ceiling. Victor abandoned his empire downtown just to breathe the same air as her. Even in the dead of night, his heavy hand would unconsciously find her flat stomach, standing guard in his sleep. You and I know that kind of suffocating grip, don't we? The kind that claims to protect while stealing your air. "You are suffocating me," Emily finally snapped after they had a simple trip to the bookstore.
"Go to the roof garden,"
he fired back, his eyes glued to his laptop. She argued that nothing would ever be secure enough for his paranoid standards. Victor finally stopped typing and met her gaze. "Exactly," he said, his voice dropping an octave. "The wolves are circling. They know about the baby. People talk, Emily. They always talk." Victor closed his laptop, the soft clicks sounding like a judge's gavel. He told her about Isabella, a ruthless widow controlling half the narcotics moving through New York. As Isabella had been whispering at a gala, spreading the word that the great Victor Moretti finally possessed a fatal weakness. His young wife was carrying his heir. Emily felt the blood freeze in her veins as she realized she was no longer just a person. She was leverage. In the brutal game of power, it is always the innocent who become the currency of war. "You do not leave this building until I neutralize the threat," Victor ordered, his voice devoid of all warmth. When she asked how long it would take, his answer was simple and chilling. "However long it takes." For 2 agonizing weeks, Emily lived as a fragile bird, locked in a sprawling golden cage. The penthouse grew smaller with each sunset. Her body began its inevitable shift, the morning sickness, the bone-deep exhaustion. Victor missed absolutely nothing. "You need to eat more," he would demand at the table, refusing to look away until she finished half her plate. The most secure prisons in this world are often built from desperate, suffocating affection. Every night, under the dim lamplight, he read medical textbooks out loud, studying fetal development like a man preparing for a holy war. "You know you are not the one carrying this baby," she whispered one night. "I know," he murmured, his guard finally dropping. "But I have to understand what is happening to you. Did you know the baby already has fingerprints?" Victor asked, turning the worn page of his textbook. "I am thorough, not a nerd," he added, the ghost of a smile touching his lips. But nothing in those heavy books would have prepared either of them for the ultrasound. Emily lay quietly on the paper-lined table as Dr. Rosso moved the wand over her stomach. Victor held her hand, his iron grip betraying his panic. And then it happened. A rapid, rhythmic thumping filled the quiet room, fast, defiant, and completely undeniable. For one shattered second, the ruthless mob boss completely crumbled. Emily saw the terrified, awestruck boy hiding beneath the monster. Sometimes the darkest souls are entirely undone by the fragile sound of new life. Perfect. Heartbeat, the doctor smiled. Measuring on track, the doctor confirmed. Gender, Victor demanded roughly. Too early yet. The drive back was soaked in heavy silence. Victor cast dark glances at her, afraid she might evaporate. "Are you okay?" she asked the shadows of the car. "No," he answered. "I have not been okay in 30 years. The truth is, time never heals deep wounds. It only teaches us how to endure the permanent limp." His rough hand found hers in the dark. "Thank you for carrying my child, for staying when you could have run." His thumb traced her knuckles. "You are stronger than I knew." Emily felt her chest tighten. "Do not do that," she whispered. "Do what?" he asked. "Be human," she breathed. "It makes this harder." "Everything is hard," he agreed softly, squeezing her cold fingers. "But we are doing it anyway." That evening, Emily crossed the line. She rolled across the wide mattress, pressing her face into Victor's chest. His heavy arms locked around her, radiating fierce heat. "Tell me it will be okay," she whispered. "I cannot," he replied softly. "I never lie. It is a hard truth, but fake comfort is worse than cold reality." His chin rested on her hair. "But I promise I will utterly destroy anyone who tries to hurt you." "Is that enough?" "It has to be," she murmured. They slept tangled in the dark, his hand shielding hers on her stomach. 2 short weeks later, the fragile peace violently shattered. Emily was reading quietly when a high-caliber bullet tore through the living room window. The air exploded into a storm of glass shards as she screamed, throwing her body blindly behind the heavy couch. Gunshots ripped through the room, rapid fire mixed with the shouts of armed men. Victor materialized, a pistol gripped in his hand. "Stay down," he roared, advancing to the shattered glass. 3 methodical shots. Marco and the guards swarmed the area. The fight lasted 30 seconds, but sheer panic always stretches time into an eternity. Then heavy silence fell. Victor cleared the angles, his wild eyes locking onto Emily. "Are you hurt?" She could only shake her head. He rushed over, hauling her up, his hands trembling violently as he checked her clothes for blood. "Any pain?" "No, the baby is fine," she gasped. "We are moving now." His iron grip was absolute. He dragged her down a hidden staircase into a cold, reinforced bunker, loaded with trauma kits and rifles. "Stay here," he commanded, his voice dark. "Marco will guard this door. I will end this," Victor declared. "Who is doing this?" she cried. "Genovese," he replied, his face carved from stone. She made her move. "Now I make mine." "You cannot go out there," Emily begged. "I will do whatever it takes," he growled. Sometimes the darkest monsters are born just to protect something fragile. He grabbed her face. "Stay inside this vault until I return. Ignore the sounds. Ignore the clock. Understand? Victor, promise me." "I promise," he swore, kissing her with brutal, desperate force before the steel door sealed him out. Emily sat in the bunker with Marco, shivering as muffled gunfire and agonizing screams echoed from the floors above. 2 long hours dragged on in the suffocating dark. Suddenly, a tiny, undeniable flutter moved deep within her stomach. It was the first time the baby moved. Emily pressed her trembling hand to her stomach. "Stay alive," she whispered. "Your father is a madman, but he is fighting for us. Just stay alive." It is a strange reflex, finding strong hope in terrifying moments. The vault door finally groaned open. Victor stood in the frame, drenched in blood. She realized quickly it was not his own. "It is done," he muttered, his voice hollow. "Genovese will never be a problem again. Neither will her men." Emily stared at the horrific violence clinging to him like a second skin. "How many?" she whispered. "Do not ask questions you cannot stomach," he warned, extending his heavy hand. "Let us get you cleaned up." She swallowed hard, taking his grip, letting him guide her upstairs into the absolute bullet-ridden ruins of their home. Bullet holes painted the walls. Blood stained the marble floors. Victor ignored the carnage, dragging her to the master suite. "Lock the door," he ordered. "I need to know you are safe." He peeled off her clothes with frantic precision, inspecting her skin. He found nothing but tiny scratches from the glass. "I am okay," Emily promised softly. "Are you really?" he choked out, his hands shaking. "You are pregnant, and men just tried to slaughter you. You are not okay. Neither am I. Guilt is truly the heaviest anchor a soul can drag." He stepped under the hot shower, fully clothed, letting the water soak them both. The red washed down the drain in pale pink streams. He pressed his wet forehead against hers, breathing hard. "I am so sorry. This is my world. You are collateral damage, and I cannot stop it." Emily's wet hands cradled his face. "Just stop," she whispered. He kissed her. It was different now. Desperate, terrified, profoundly human. She kissed him back. Not out of romance, but because clarity had set in. "You and I must realize that mutual survival binds people tighter than love ever could." They were both trapped, willing to do whatever it took to live. When they broke apart, Victor's eyes were haunted. "I cannot lose you," he confessed. "I thought this was just business, but I cannot." "You will not," she answered. "You do not know that," he argued. "Neither do you," Emily replied, her voice iron steady. "So we keep fighting. We keep surviving, because that is what we do now." Victor nodded slowly in the steam. "When did you get so strong?" he asked. "You taught me," Emily replied, offering a smile full of tragic, quiet bitterness. She told him he had dragged her down into his dark world. His rough thumb gently traced her cheekbone as he disagreed. He told her she was better than him, that she always had been. That night, the thick walls between them finally crumbled. They came together willingly. It was not a violent clash, just two broken people seeking warmth, while the ruthless city outside threatened to consume them. As Emily drifted to sleep, feeling his hand resting protectively over their unborn child, a profound truth settled in her chest. She was falling deeply for the man who had taken her captive. The next morning, the sheets were ice cold. She woke up entirely alone. Wandering the silent halls, she found him locked in his office at dawn, obsessively watching the security tapes from the recent assassination attempt. "You and I know that trauma makes ghosts out of memories." He sat rewinding the footage, dissecting every frame as if staring hard enough could rewrite the past. Emily stood in the doorway, pleading with him to sleep. Victor refused to look away from the monitors. He was tormented by the fact that the gunmen had made it within 30 feet of her. She reminded him those men were dead now, ended by his own hand. Victor spun around, his bloodshot eyes completely haunted. He knew there would always be more enemies. Emily stepped close, gently prying the remote from his rigid fingers, and killed the video feeds. She begged him to come to bed, but his deep voice shattered as he confessed his darkest fear. Every time he closed his heavy eyes, he saw her bleeding. He saw them losing their unborn child. The agonizing weight of his past was crushing him. He looked at her, his voice broken, admitting he could not survive losing another child. Emily did not offer pity. Her tone grew sharp, demanding he stop mourning her while she was still breathing. She firmly reminded him their baby was safe, and he had saved them. Victor stared at her in the dim light before letting her guide him down the hall. He collapsed onto the mattress without removing his clothes. As Emily curled against his chest, a dark confession spilled out. He had killed 6 men the night before. The terrifying part, he felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no guilt, just pure freezing efficiency. He wondered if he was completely unglued, his arm tightening around her as he accepted just how far from a normal life he truly was. Emily reached out, finding his hand in the dark. If he was broken, what did that make her? She had watched him walk, drenched in blood, feeling nothing but pure relief. Victor traced protective circles over her stomach. He told her she was adapting. It was not a moral failure. It was evolution. Or maybe it was corruption. Here is a lesson for us all sometimes. Survival and sin wear the exact same face. In the weeks that followed, a strange duality took hold. With Emily Victor transformed, he became deeply tender, attending every medical visit and obsessing over parenting books. But to the outside world, the crime boss became an absolute monster. The sheer contrast was terrifying. One morning, Emily simply sat there, drinking her tea, watching her devoted husband calmly order a man killed over a plate of eggs. Emily sat across from a man who could ruin a senator before the appetizers arrived and completely erase a rival syndicate by dessert. She watched the casual cruelty in his eyes, feeling the heavy kick of the life growing inside her own body. Victor had asked her, his voice stripped of its usual armor, if seeing the monster he truly was bothered her. Her answer was chillingly simple. She told him that his darkness was the very thing keeping them safe. The truth is, survival forces us to embrace the shadows to protect the light. And there was light, glowing brightly on the clinic monitor during their 20-week ultrasound. Dr. Russo guided the wand across Emily, revealing a perfect spine and a tiny beating heart. The doctor asked the question that changes everything. Did they want to know? Emily glanced at Victor. On the outside, he was carved from stone, the untouchable king of the underworld, but his hand shook violently against hers. When the doctor announced it was a girl, the king fell. His knees literally gave out. 30 long years of buried, agonizing grief broke through the ice of his soul. As the doctor confirmed the baby was perfectly healthy, Victor collapsed against Emily's hand, weeping in a silent, world-ending kind of way. He was pulled back to Sophia, the ghost of his past, and the daughter stolen from him. You see, grief never truly leaves us alone. It just waits patiently in the dark, ready to break us open. The second we finally dare to hope. Emily pulled his tear-stained face upward, forcing him to look into her steady eyes. She anchored him to the present, reminding him that this was their daughter, a completely new soul. Victor was drowning in the agonizing fear of failing again, terrified that his violent world would claim another innocent life. But Emily offered him the purest kind of devotion. She promised that if they fell, they would fall together. We cannot let the fear of repeating our tragic past stop us from embracing a beautiful future. Victor, struggling to rebuild his shattered emotional walls, asked if they could name her Isabella. It was a plea for redemption, a desperate wish to honor the child stolen from his hands, while pouring all his broken love into the second chance growing inside Emily. Isabella. The name hung in the air like a sacred vow. Victor kissed her hand, pressing his to her wrist with the reverence of a man praying for salvation. He whispered his gratitude, thanking her for surviving the hell he had dragged her through. Emily could not even speak. She simply held this terrifying man while he unraveled. True strength is not about never breaking. It is about having the courage to fall apart in the arms of someone you trust. The drive home was wrapped in heavy silence. Victor kept his hand resting firmly on Emily, needing physical proof that this miracle was real. But peace never lasts long for a man at war. His anxiety clawed back, telling him 4 months was not nearly enough time to build a proper fortress. The frantic need to protect his bloodline consumed him entirely. Victor began demanding the impossible armed guards rotating outside the nursery, pediatricians on constant standby. Emily told him he was spiraling, but to a man who had lost everything, planning was the only barrier against death. The illusion of control is the only comfort we have when we are terrified of losing what we love. Within days, Victor tore apart a guest room and built a sanctuary. It was painted in soft, rigged with climate sensors, and guarded by heavy security. At 2 a.m, Emily found the most dangerous man in the city, kneeling on the floor, obsessively tightening the screws of a wooden crib. He refused any help. This was a penance he had to pay with his own 2 hands. Victor tightened a bolt, his voice heavy with the ghosts of his childhood. His father had given him nothing but cold expectations and money, never genuine warmth. Victor wanted his daughter to rest in something built by her father's own hands. Generational trauma only stops when someone actively chooses to build instead of break. But shadows still crept around the edges of his mind. He confessed his darkest fear to Emily, that he could give Isabella the world, but never guarantee her safety. He had made too many ruthless enemies. Emily lowered herself to the floor beside him. She told him that they would simply have to forge their own safety in the high fires of his empire. They would fight harder, plan smarter, and survive together against the coming storm. Victor looked at her, bewildered by her sudden strength, and asked when she became the fearless one in their dynamic. Emily smiled, admitting they balanced each other out in a beautifully unhealthy way. And then, a miracle happened. Victor laughed. It was a rusty, unfamiliar sound that startled them both. He confessed the darkness had stolen his joy years ago, but she had brought it back. Listen to me. You and I both know the people who can pull genuine laughter from our deepest sorrow are the ones worth fighting for. But the peace of that late-night revelation shattered by dawn. The outside world was knocking on their carefully guarded door. Maria appeared with grim news. Emily's estranged mother was demanding a visit, instantly threatening their fragile bubble. Welcome back to the Midnight Broadcast. Let's step right into the tension of a penthouse that feels more like a vault. Emily's blood turned to absolute ice. Tell her I'm fine. Tell her we're traveling. But her mother was already on the way, armed with an address and a mother's intuition. Emily looked at Victor, panic stripping her breath. Victor, ever the tactician, made the call. Let her come. He told Emily she had to be flawless. Can you do that while 5 months pregnant? His voice was stone. He left her no choice. By 3 o'clock, the door opened. Emily stood there in a maternity dress, worth more than her mother's yearly rent, her belly impossible to hide. You and I both know the hardest lies to tell are the ones we wear on our own skin. The revelation hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. In 3 seconds, her mother's face shattered shock, bleeding into deep hurt, then hardening into white-hot fury. You're pregnant, and you didn't tell us. The betrayal in her voice was colder than winter. 5 months married to a phantom they had never met. Victor stepped right into the role of the perfect, untroubled husband. He extended a hand that had ruined lives, offering a calm apology. We were trying to get settled. But her mother wasn't a fool. She completely ignored his hand, turning a piercing glare to her daughter. Who is this man, really? Emily's voice trembled as she claimed him as her husband. The lesson here is simple. You can dress a wolf in a tailored suit, but a mother always smells the danger. I love him. We're having a baby. The words tumbled out, desperate to be believed. But her mother's eyes were too sharp, cutting straight through the expensive illusion. She saw the quiet terror humming beneath Emily's skin. Before Emily could crumble, Victor stepped forward. The polite husband vanished, replaced by the chilling, dangerous warlord. I'm protecting her, he stated, his tone dropping the temperature in the room. He pointed to the luxury, the designer clothes, equating wealth with safety. But her mother just let out a hollow, bitter laugh. She looks like a prisoner in a gold cage. Emily threw herself between them, begging for peace. It is a tragic truth we often ignore. A cage doesn't stop being a cage just because the bars are made of solid gold. The air in the room grew heavy, the kind of tension you can almost taste. Emily stood her ground, claiming she chose this life. She chose Victor. But a mother's eyes see past the armor. She searched Emily's face, asking if someone else made that choice for her. Silence crashed over them. Victor stood frozen, a statue ever carved from cold stone. After a suffocating moment, her mother offered a slow nod, leaving a simple lifeline: call me if you ever need to run. As the door finally clicked shut, Emily's brave facade shattered. She slid down the wall, the terrible truth ringing in her head. Her mother knew. You and I both know this truth. You can lie to the rest of the world, but you can rarely fool the people who raised you. Suspicion is a dangerous seed, and Victor never left things to chance. His eyes turned to ice as he pulled out his phone, ordering 24/7 surveillance on Emily's mother and sister. Every step, every phone call to the cops or the FBI he needed to know. Emily stared at him, horrified that he would spy on her own blood. But Victor's logic was an impenetrable wall. He claimed he was protecting them. If her mother kept digging, she would unearth secrets that could get them all killed. He gripped Emily's shoulders, swearing he would not hurt them, but making it brutally clear that safety required total control. It is a bitter lesson to learn. Control is often dressed up as protection, but true love can never be built on a foundation of cages and endless shadows. Victor insisted he needed to know everything to keep them breathing. Emily wanted to scream and fight back, but exhaustion weighed heavy on her bones. Heavily pregnant and completely trapped, she simply whispered her surrender. Victor pulled her close, asking for her trust, but that was a currency she no longer had. Later, while the city slept, she lay wide awake. Victor's hand rested gently on her stomach, feeling their unborn daughter kick. She stared at the man in the dark. He had stolen her freedom, yet somehow became the absolute center of her universe. Life shows us this confusing reality time and time again. The human heart rarely follows the rules of logic, and sometimes it foolishly beats for the very forces that broke it in the first place. The terrible truth was that she loved him desperately, even while her instincts screamed it was wrong. Victor called it a syndrome, but Emily called it pure survival. At 6 months pregnant, her body felt completely alien. Victor filled the penthouse with experts, managing her like a corporate project. When she complained she felt like a mere incubator, Victor did not sugarcoat it. He coldly told her she was the most important incubator in his empire. It was a brutal thing to say, yet, moments later, he left his work, knelt on the floor, and gently took her swollen feet into his hands to ease her pain. It is a strange thing about human nature. We often find the deepest moments of genuine care hiding right behind the sharpest, most unfeeling words. Emily watched in quiet disbelief. His hands were unbelievably gentle as he explained that his late wife, Sophia, used to have the exact same pain. The name hung in the air like a ghost. Victor's voice lost its iron edge, growing completely broken. He confessed that speaking of her meant inviting the raw grief back in, a luxury he could not afford. She was 23, pregnant, and he thought they had forever. Then rivals came, striking at his family to destroy his spirit. His hands stopped moving on Emily's skin. The brutal truth spilled out. They were right. It completely broke him. Here is the quiet tragedy of carrying a heavy past. We build massive walls to keep out the pain of yesterday, only to realize we are simply locking the ghost inside the room with us. For 10 long years, Victor became a nightmare of vengeance. He tore apart his enemies, making them watch their loved ones fall before taking their lives. Most would have run from a confession like that. Emily should have pulled away in terror. But looking into his haunted eyes, she finally understood his paranoia. He was terrified the past was coming back for blood. Victor swore he would burn the entire world to ash before letting anyone touch her or their unborn child. Emily gently touched his face, admitting his darkness terrified her, but not enough to make her walk away. Stick with me here, because this shows the strange gravity of connection. Sometimes the very scars that make a person dangerous are the exact same reasons we decide to stay and hold their hand in the dark. Emily offered a cold truth. She stayed because Victor terrified the rest of the world far more than her, and that fear was their shield. A devastating smile crossed his face. He knew he had molded her into this survivor. As his hand rested on her stomach, feeling their child kick, heavy guilt washed over him. But Emily stopped his apology. Morals and ethics had lost all meaning in their dark world. There was only breathing, or being buried. Victor leaned down, kissing her stomach, her hand and finally her lips. Against her mouth he confessed he loved her, even if he didn't deserve to. It is a harsh reality. Sometimes extreme survival strips away all our polite ideals, leaving behind only the raw, undeniable truth of who we truly need to keep us alive. Hearing those words cracked Emily's chest open. Victor quickly told her she didn't owe him a confession. He knew the monster he was, but he needed her to understand she was no longer a transaction. She was his entire universe. Tears spilled down Emily's cheeks as she laid out the brutal facts. He had stolen her, caged her, and robbed her of every choice. Her voice shattered as she admitted the agonizing truth. God help her. She loved him anyway. Victor kissed her with desperate hunger, clinging to her like she was the only oxygen left in a burning room. And perhaps she was. True connection is rarely a perfect picture. Often, it is messy, terrifying, and pulls us directly toward the very people we once believed we were supposed to escape. A false labor scare sent Victor into an absolute tailspin. He shouted for the car, hands visibly shaking, ignoring Emily's calm reminders that the pain was normal. Victor didn't care. He wasn't taking chances. They spent 4 agonizing hours at the hospital, with Victor forcing the medical staff to run every test twice. On the quiet ride back, Emily had to pull him out of his dark spiral. She held his trembling hand, forcing him to look into her eyes, promising their little family was safe. His voice finally broke in the dim light. The terrifying Vought confessed that while he had survived countless wars, losing her would completely destroy him. It shows us a profound truth. The absolute toughest armor on the outside always protects the most fragile, terrified heart on the inside. Decades of bloodshed had not broken him, but living without her was the one war he would lose. Emily squeezed his hand. She told him to keep being the terrifying monster the world feared, because that monster was their only shield. He whispered she wasn't supposed to love a monster. With a sad smile, she replied she wasn't supposed to do a lot of things, yet here they were. He held her as if she might vanish. Weeks later, crippled by late-night anxiety, Emily wandered the quiet penthouse. At 3 a.m, she found Victor, standing perfectly still in the shadows of the nursery, staring into an empty crib. You and I know this strange shift. The deeply flawed people who once scared us often become the exact souls we rely on to finally feel safe. She asked softly if he was awake too. Victor's voice echoed with crushing guilt. He was paralyzed by the thought of failing his daughter, drowning in memories of the lives he had ruined. What if his darkness destroyed her too? Emily crossed the dim room, taking his hand and pressing it against her stomach. Right on cue, their child kicked. Emily reminded him that the baby already knew his voice, already loved him before taking a single breath. At those words, the ruthless boss's face completely crumpled. He whispered that he didn't deserve such pure love. The lesson here is profoundly humbling. None of us truly deserve the unconditional grace of the people who love us. Our only real job is to spend every waking day trying to be worthy of it. Emily kissed him, promising he'd be an amazing father, an overbearing, security-obsessed nightmare, but wonderful. When he asked if she believed that, her voice dropped. She had to believe it. They were bringing a fragile life into a war zone, and she needed his ruthless nature to keep them alive. Victor wrapped his arms around her, vowing he would die trying. They stood in the quiet nursery, 2 damaged souls holding each other while their unborn child kicked between them. She was their ultimate second chance. It is a vital reminder that no matter how shattered your past is, broken people are perfectly capable of building something beautiful. 2 weeks later, the quiet ended. Emily woke with a sharp gasp, shaking Victor awake in the dark. It was time. At her words, the boss was on his feet in seconds, barking orders for the car. Emily told him to breathe. He insisted he was fine, but his hands shook so violently he couldn't tie his shoes. A breathless laugh escaped Emily. This man had ended lives without a flinch, yet was undone by simple shoelaces. Victor abandoned the shoes, grabbing her bag with a wild look. This was different, he confessed. Everything before this was just ugly survival. This was actual life, and he was terrified he didn't know how to navigate it. Emily gripped his hand, promising they would figure it out together. We've all faced moments like this, haven't we? That pivotal crossroad where your past experience means absolutely nothing, and you simply have to step blindly into the beautiful, terrifying unknown. The hospital was pure chaos, but Victor anchored her through 14 grueling hours. He let her crush his hand during contractions, refusing to leave. Finally, the sharp cry of Isabella Rose Moretti echoed in the room. In that moment, the ruthless kingpin died. Victor wept openly, 30 years of frozen grief, washing out of his soul all at once. The doctor placed the tiny girl on Emily's chest. Victor reached out with a trembling hand, whispering breathless thank yous to the woman who gave him his life back. Looking at the man who had torn her world apart, Emily understood a profound truth. Redemption doesn't magically erase a bitter past, but it can build a beautiful future from the ashes. She didn't see a monster anymore. She just saw a broken man, finally holding his entire world. Welcome back to the midnight hour. Let's step into a hospital room where the air is thick with a heavy, desperate quiet. Emily looked at the hardened man beside her. "Do you want to hold her?" she asked. Victor couldn't even form words. He just nodded. As Emily placed little Isabella into his arms, this man of absolute violence held the baby like she was spun glass. "Hello, Isabella," he whispered, his deep voice trembling. "I'm your father. I promise no one will ever hurt you. I'll destroy anyone who tries." When that tiny hand wrapped around his calloused finger, Victor broke. Silent tears fell. Emily watched them, realizing this family was built on survival. Sometimes, the life you have isn't the one you planned, but you still have to embrace the messy, beautiful reality of it. Watching Victor hold that baby, Emily realized something that should have terrified her. She wouldn't change a thing. Victor didn't close his eyes for 3 days. Emily would wake in the quiet dark to find him looming over the bassinet. He watched her breathe, counting every rise of her chest, as if his sheer willpower kept her heart beating. "You need to rest," Emily urged. Victor's eyes were red and haunted. "I'll rest when she's safe," he muttered. Emily pointed out the guards in the secure room, but Victor's jaw clenched tighter. Too many exits, too many blind spots. It is a hard truth, but sometimes the deep fear of losing what we cherish the most turns us into prisoners of our own minds. "We're going home today," Victor announced, leaving no room for debate. When Emily protested that the doctor wanted them to stay, Victor didn't blink. "The doctor works for me now. She'll come to the penthouse." He finally looked at Emily, admitting he couldn't protect them in a place with so many variables. Emily swallowed her argument. She saw the raw terror driving him. They left that afternoon. Victor carried Isabella like a priceless artifact, refusing to let anyone come close. When they arrived, the penthouse was a fortress. Armed guards paced the halls. New security cameras tracked every angle. "This is insane," Emily breathed. "The lengths we go to for security often isolate us, reminding us that the search for total control is born from unspoken panic." "This is necessary," Victor replied, carefully placing Isabella into her crib. "You don't understand what you've given me. Every enemy I have will see her as a pawn. I can't let that happen." Emily pressed him, asking if his plan was to lock their daughter in this penthouse forever. Victor was dead serious when he said he would. "Victor, that's not a life," she pleaded. He turned to face her, the ghosts of his past loud in the room. "You don't know what it's like to hold your child's dead body. I do, and I will destroy anyone to make sure she doesn't end up the same way. You and I know all too well that our darkest scars dictate how we defend our future. But we eventually have to accept that we cannot control every variable. Then we control what we can and fight the rest." Emily whispered, gently taking his hand. "But we don't lock her away. We teach her to survive, just like you taught me." Victor stared down at the crib, murmuring about how fragile she was. Emily squeezed his fingers. "She's a Moretti. She's stronger than she looks. Trust that." That first week back was an absolute nightmare. The baby cried without end, and Victor was torn between being a loving father and a ruthless boss. At 2 a.m, Emily walked into the nursery and stopped dead. There was Victor, feeding Isabella a bottle, with a loaded handgun resting right on the changing table. You're holding our daughter while armed, she snapped. It is strange how love pushes us into wild extremes. The safety is on. I checked it 3 times, Victor replied. His gaze locked on his daughter's tiny features. He explained that his men had intercepted bad intel. A rival family was sniffing around, looking into hospital security tapes. Emily's voice dropped. What does that mean? Victor's grip on the baby bottle turned white-knuckled. He told her he had already sent word through the underworld. If anyone even looked at Isabella, their families would be wiped out. You're declaring war over a baby, Emily said, stunned. Victor finally looked up at her, his dark eyes hollow. I'm declaring war over my baby. There's a difference. When fear takes hold of a man who only knows violence, his panic always looks exactly like rage. He was terrified. Isabella finally finished her bottle, and Victor lifted her to his broad shoulder. He patted her back with a gentleness that did not fit his dark reputation. When she let out a tiny burp, Victor smiled like he had just witnessed a miracle. She's perfect, he whispered into the quiet nursery, and that terrifies me more than anything. Emily watched this blood-stained man cradle a fragile new life. The contradiction was devastating. Come to bed, she urged. We'll figure out the problem tomorrow. But Victor's voice turned to ice. There is no problem. By tomorrow, that family won't even exist. He had already given the order. It is a chilling truth, but sometimes the things we do in the name of total devotion look just like acts of profound evil. By morning, anyone who had thought about harming their little girl would be in the ground. Now, you and I both know Emily should have been horrified. She should have fought him. Instead, a cold wash of relief flooded her veins. Those strangers had threatened her baby, and Isabella's safety was worth more than a clean conscience. She wondered what she was becoming. Thank you, she murmured. Victor's harsh eyes softened. You're welcome. They went to sleep holding each other, while miles away, their enemies bled out. Time moved on. At 3 weeks old, Isabella gave her first smile. Emily walked in to find Victor frozen, thick tears rolling down his scarred cheeks. Peace always comes with a heavy price, forcing us to realize what we are willing to sacrifice. She smiled at me. Victor choked out, his deep voice completely wrecked. Emily, she smiled. Emily gently suggested it might just be gas. No, it was real, he insisted, his rough thumb tracing the baby's soft cheek. She knows me. She knows her father. Emily's throat tightened painfully. This was a man who had orchestrated a bloodbath just hours before, and here he was weeping over an infant's grin. She loves you, Emily told him. Victor shook his head. How can she? She doesn't know what I've done. Emily reminded him that Isabella knew he would burn the entire world down to keep her safe. Maybe that had to be enough, and it does. Sometimes the fierce desire to protect is the only untainted thing a damaged heart has left to offer the world. When little Isabella hit 6 weeks, a ghost knocked on the fortified door. Emily's mother showed up completely unannounced. Marco, the loyal enforcer, tried to block the entrance, but she pushed right past him. I want to meet my granddaughter, she demanded. You can shoot me, or you can let me see her. Victor emerged from the shadows, calm but radiating danger. He warned her it wasn't a good time. She didn't flinch. She challenged Victor to either step aside or explain to Emily why he kept her own family away. Vic studied the woman and coldly granted her exactly 1 hour. Emily walked into the room, holding the baby tight. Her mother's stern face crumbled. We try so hard to build walls, but family always has a way of breaking through our defenses. The older woman crossed the heavy rug and took the baby with shaking hands. She's beautiful, she murmured, noting the Italian name with a sharp edge. Then she looked deep into Emily's eyes and asked the hardest question. Are you happy? Really happy? Emily considered spinning a lie but chose a darker truth. I'm surviving, she whispered. Some days that's enough, and other days I love him so much it terrifies me. She knew exactly how this toxic life looked from the outside. Her mother warned that complicated men are dangerous. Emily just pulled her daughter back. All men are dangerous. Victor is just honest about it. Sometimes we adapt to the shadows so completely that the normal daylight starts to hurt our eyes, changing who we are at our core. "You really have changed," her mother said, sorrow bleeding into the quiet room. Emily offered a broken smile. She had to. The innocent girl her mother raised never would have survived Victor's world. That girl had died months ago. When her mother pressed, asking if he hit her, Emily shook her head. He loved her the only way a fractured man could possessively, obsessively, without limits. And heaven help her, she loved him exactly the same way. Her mother called it a trauma bond. Emily just kissed her baby's head. Maybe it was. But it was her bond and her deliberate choice. Before leaving, her mother promised to come for them if she ever wanted out. Emily politely declined. We build our homes in strange places, and sometimes scars become our foundation. Emily's voice didn't waver. This was her family now, for better or for blood. Her mother nodded slowly, accepting defeat, and walked out. The moment the lock clicked, Victor melted out of the shadows. "She's going to be a problem," he noted grimly. Emily just shifted the baby in her arms, sighing that, of course, she was a problem. She was family. She assured him the woman wouldn't interfere. And if she tried, Emily looked right into Victor's dark eyes and told him they would handle it together. Victor leaned down, kissing her forehead. "I really have corrupted you completely," he murmured. Emily could only offer a bitter, knowing smile. Time kept moving. Even in the darkest and most isolated lives, ordinary moments of grace managed to slip through the cracks. Then it happened. A bright, bubbling sound of pure laughter that seemed to stop the earth. Victor froze in place. "Did you hear that?" he breathed. Emily, recording on her phone, smiled. "I heard. Do it again." Victor twisted his face, and Isabella let out another joyous laugh. This hardened killer scooped his daughter up, lifting her high and spinning her while she shrieked with delight. Emily watched the man who had stolen her from her past, holding the baby she never planned to have. She realized she was happy, not despite the madness, but because of it. Listen to me, sometimes the very things that break us are the exact pieces we use to build our salvation. The trauma had forged an unbreakable intimacy. It was toxic, but in the end, it was beautifully theirs. The stillness of the bedroom felt heavy, broken only by the soft rhythm of little Isabella breathing between them. Victor laid his scarred hand over Emily's. He wanted more children, more family. No more cold, ink-stained contracts binding them together. He was laying his soul bare, asking her as his husband, not captor. Emily just looked at him, seeing the desperate hope in the eyes of a man who usually only knew how to take. She told him to ask again in a year, if they survived whatever was coming. "You and I know that sometimes the most beautiful things grow in the darkest soil. We just have to be patient enough to let them bloom." That quiet, maybe, was all Victor needed to keep breathing. 6 months in, Isabella rolled over on her own. Victor practically tore the phone off the hook to call Emily at the gym, breathless like he had just witnessed a miracle. And to him it was. By 9 months, she was crawling, and that shadow of paranoia crept right back into Victor's heart. He patted every corner, locked every cabinet, trying to build an impenetrable fortress. We all try to build walls to keep the pain out, do we not? But you cannot bubble wrap a human life forever. You can only hold their hand tight while they learn to navigate the sharp edges of this world. Victor's jaw tightened whenever Emily pushed back against his suffocating rules. Every time Isabella stumbled, Victor saw ghosts. He saw the violent threats lurking in the shadows. And worse, he saw his first daughter, Sophia, the one he had already lost, haunting his every waking moment. Emily recognized the terror bleeding through his eyes and softly reminded him that Isabella was alive and safe. Knowing a truth and actually believing it in your bones are two very different battles. Trauma is a relentless thief that steals our present joy, but patience can slowly buy it back. They celebrated her first birthday quietly, surrounded only by Marco, Maria, and a few trusted souls. Little Isabella was an absolute mess, her tiny hands covered in sweet frosting, laughing wildly as Victor tried to gently wipe her face. Emily stood back, watching them, whispering that it had been the longest year of her entire life. The shadows of their brutal world were always looming, the death bridge, the constant paranoia, the deadly attacks. But Victor just smiled, that heavy, dark smile of his. He told her he would never apologize for the blood on his hands, because that violence had bought them this exact moment of peace. Life is strange that way. Sometimes the darkest, most terrifying storms are exactly what clear the path for the sun to shine. 18 months in, the entire world stopped spinning when Isabella spoke her very first word, Dada. The ruthless, terrifying man who ruled the criminal underworld crumbled right there on the floor. Victor held his baby girl and just wept, heavy sobs shaking his massive frame, begging her to say it again. He looked up at Emily, terrified she would only ever see a monster. But Emily was fierce in her reassurance, telling him he was simply a father who loved his child. We are not defined the worst things we have done. In the dark, my friends, we are defined by the pure love we choose to embrace when the light finally finds us. Emily knelt beside them, pulling both of her broken, beautiful pieces into her arms. She told him that she did not see a killer, but the man who held her during panic attacks, the man who made ridiculous faces just to hear his daughter laugh. The rest was just the ugly cost of survival. By the time Isabella turned 2, those wobbly legs took their first real steps. Victor caught her every time she fell, lifting her high. They practiced for an hour straight, Isabella walking, Victor catching. Emily simply sat back, watching her family exist in peace. It takes a lot of falling down to learn how to stand, but having someone catch you changes everything. Later that night, the city lights flickered below them as Victor found Emily out on the balcony. He asked her what she was thinking, gently tracing the delicate line of her cheekbone. 2 years ago, she hated this man. She wanted to run as far away from his dark world as possible. Now, he was a brutal, violent man who had destroyed countless lives, and yet he was the only place she ever wanted to call home. Love does not always make sense, and it rarely follows the rules we set for it. They had long outlived the cold 18-month deadline of their old contract. The paper meant nothing now, because true loyalty is written in the soul. Picture the heavy silence in that room. Gave her an out. He told her she could take her trust fund and vanish into the night, start completely over. But Emily knew the catch. He would never let her take their daughter, Isabella. There was zero hesitation in his voice, the child stays. So Emily stood her ground, her voice a calm anchor in his chaotic storm. She wasn't just staying for the little girl anymore. She looked at this dangerous man and told him they were family now. He had given her no choice in the beginning, but right here, in this quiet moment, she was making her own choice. She chose him, darkness and all. You see, sometimes real loyalty isn't about finding a perfect situation, but choosing to water the roots you already planted. She knew exactly who he was, and she accepted it because his ruthless nature was the very shield that kept them breathing. That is a heavy truth to carry. 3 years drifted by. The impossible happened again. Emily was pregnant. When she broke the news, Victor, the cold mob boss, broke down and wept. He honestly believed she wasn't ready to bring another life into their dangerous world. But Emily just laughed, a soft, genuine sound. She told him their daughter needed a sibling to help carry the heavy shadow of the Moretti name. She wanted this. She wanted their messy, unconventional life to keep growing. It teaches us something profound. Even the hardest hearts can completely shatter when faced with unconditional acceptance. Little Isabella burst into the room, a blur of pure childhood energy, begging her parents to play. Victor scooped her up effortlessly, breaking the news that she was going to be a big sister. The little girl cheered, clapping her hands with pure joy, and Emily just stood there, letting the scene wash over her. Let's be honest with each other for a second. This wasn't the fairy tale she dreamed of as a kid. It was a life forged in the fires of desperation, a terrifying contract that somehow morphed into genuine love. Was it healthy or normal? Not even a little, but it was undeniably theirs. Sometimes life hands you shattered glass, and the only meaningful thing you can do is carefully piece it together into a stained glass window that is entirely your own. 5 years after that brutal contract bound them, Emily watched the man, who once terrified her, gently rock their second daughter to sleep. Victor caught her staring and asked what was on her mind. Her answer was painfully honest. She told him she should absolutely hate him. She knew any textbook would label her damaged, citing trauma bonds and psychological syndromes. But standing in that quiet nursery, she confessed that none of those labels mattered anymore. She chose to stay when the doors were finally unlocked. Why? Because through the terror, he gave her a deep, undeniable purpose. He gave her a family. It goes to show that sometimes, the very things that threaten to destroy us are the exact tools we use to build an unbreakable foundation. She looked him dead in the eyes and admitted he had broken her, only to rebuild her into something stronger. Victor flashed a deeply sad smile, knowing she was right. They stood shoulder to shoulder in the dim light of the nursery, a family raised from the ashes of extreme violence. The innocent woman who sold her freedom to save her loved ones was gone, replaced by a fierce mother and queen of a dark empire. And the most chilling part? She would not change a single second of her past. You and I both know that love does not always arrive with flowers and gentle words. Sometimes it is forged in absolute fire, taught by literal monsters who slowly learn how to be human, just to keep the one light they have ever known from going out. In a harsh world where merely surviving requires a brutal kind of evolution, the captive had fallen in love with the man who took everything from her. Victor Moretti had demanded an heir and stripped away her freedom. Yet, in return, she handed him the one thing he never dared to ask for: true redemption. He certainly did not deserve it, but that is the beauty of a broken soul. They tend to find other shattered pieces and glue them together into something striking. Later that night, lying beside the man she once feared, with their children sleeping safely nearby, Emily whispered a truth she never thought she would feel. She was actually glad he took her. Real growth often requires us to find absolute peace within the storms we never asked to weather. Victor instantly pulled her closer, his voice trembling as he told her never to say that. He knew exactly what he was, and he knew everything he did to her in the beginning was unforgivable. But Emily just rested her hand over his, pressing it to her stomach, where their third child was already taking shape. She told him that despite all the trauma, all the unforgivable nights, it led them to this exact quiet moment. Victor's voice broke as he whispered she was either the most damaged soul alive or the absolute strongest. Emily turned to him, looking straight into his tired eyes, and declared she was both. The most vital lesson we can ever learn is that true peace comes not from forgetting our scars, but from choosing to let them heal. Picture this: the man who once walked through bullets without blinking, now paralyzed by the fear of losing the family he pulled from the ashes. That fear didn't make Victor weak. It made him careful. It made him human. And then there is Emily. 5 years ago, at just 22, her own father traded her future for his life. A ruthless contract stripped away her freedom in 10 seconds. Now, at 27, she is a mother of 2, with a third on the way. She is the wife of the man who burned her world down, only to build her a throne from the embers. She reigns over an empire steeped in blood, and a love that defies all logic. If you offered Emily the chance to go back, to tear up that paper and walk free, she would sign it again, every single time. You and I have probably spent late nights wondering how pain can mutate into something beautiful. This story leaves us with a heavy, uncomfortable truth. Sometimes, the absolute worst thing that ever happens to you, I crossed the street, grabbed his shirt, the tragedy that shatters your soul and steals your choices, somehow becomes the foundation of the best thing you never knew you needed. Life has a twisted way of handing us our salvation, wrapped in a nightmare. We constantly look for angels to save us, but reality is far more complicated than a simple bedtime story. In the dark, bleeding corners of this world, where survival costs everything you have, the lines between good and evil completely blur. Sometimes, the monsters fiercely protect what is theirs, and sometimes the monsters end up making the best fathers.
One of the most important lessons from Emily Carteret's story is that sacrifice can come from love, but that does not automatically make the situation fair or beautiful. Emily agrees to put her chance sister has placed the family in danger. And Victor uses that danger to force Emily into an impossible choice. This teaches a serious educational lesson. When people are desperate, they may accept conditions that they would never accept if they're under normal circumstances. Emily's choice is brave because it comes from love, but it is also tragic because it is made under coercion. The story should not be read as a simple romance where sacrifice magically becomes destiny. It shows how vulnerable people can be trapped when someone powerful controls money, safety, and information. Emily's love for her family becomes the very weakness Victor uses against her. That is painful but realistic. In real life, many people sacrifice their dreams, education, relationships, or freedom to protect loved ones. Sometimes sacrifice is necessary, but it becomes dangerous when others exploit it. The educational value here is to recognize the difference between voluntary sacrifice and forced sacrifice. Emily, she is strong, loyal, and deeply human. But Victor's manipulation is still wrong. A meaningful lesson for viewers is that love should not require someone to give up their body, future, or dignity under threat. True family protection should come from support, honesty, and shared responsibility, not from one person carrying the entire burden alone. Emily's story reminds us to respect sacrifice, but never glorify the systems that makes such sacrifice necessary.